It's time for a Bower bombshell. Tom, you're hearing of some post-coronation tensions between Queen Camilla and the Princess of Wales, Kate?
Absolutely. What was very interesting was I heard from people who were very, very much involved 20-odd years ago, more than 20 years ago, in resurrecting Camilla.
Catherine's eyes stopped on the man standing at the back of the Balmoral briefing room, and within seconds, the entire meeting was about to collapse. She did not recognize him. He was close enough to hear a restricted discussion, yet nobody appeared to be challenging his presence. Then Catherine looked toward Charles. The king followed her gaze. The folder in front of him remained open for only another moment before his hand came down and the briefing stopped. Charles asked who had authorized the man to enter. Security checked the attendance list. The names were reviewed again, then once more. The man was not listed among the approved attendees. In a room where every entrance was supposed to have a reason, that single omission suddenly carried enormous weight. The briefing was not continuing until the stranger's clearance was established. Hi viewers, be honest. If you were Catherine and noticed someone inside a private meeting who should not have been there, would you speak up or stay quiet to avoid causing trouble? Leave your answer in the comments, because that one choice could change everything in this story. And if you believe a royal briefing should never be treated casually, like this video and subscribe. Sometimes silence protects the wrong people, while speaking up forces uncomfortable questions into the open. Catherine did not look away. The man had already avoided her eyes twice, and that reaction made her unease harder to dismiss. William leaned toward her, trying to understand what had caught her attention. She explained that she had never seen the man among people normally admitted to sensitive discussions. William listened. He did not immediately accuse anyone. He looked toward the rear of the room and studied the stranger for himself. Charles was already waiting for an explanation. His expression tightened as the security officer approached the attendance record. Balmoral was being treated as a tightly controlled royal residence, a place where private family discussions could happen away from the pressure surrounding the monarchy in London. That made the stranger's position more troubling. He was not standing outside a public reception. He was inside a meeting where sensitive responsibilities and future plans were being discussed. The security officer checked the list twice before giving Charles the answer. The man's name appeared nowhere. Charles closed the folder. The scheduled discussion was over, at least for the moment. No one would continue until the access problem had been understood. That decision changed the atmosphere instantly.
This is also a time of change for my family. I count on the loving help of my darling wife, Camilla. In recognition of her own loyal public service since our marriage 17 years ago.
Catherine had not demanded the meeting stop. She had simply noticed something that did not fit. Charles had taken the next step himself. The unfamiliar Aide tried to explain his presence. According to the account, he claimed that a senior household office had instructed him to attend. The explanation should have settled the immediate question if he could produce authorization. He could not. Charles asked for the name of the person who had approved him. The answer remained incomplete. He had no document, no clear confirmation, and no place on the official attendance list. Camilla remained unusually still. The Queen Consort was connected to the Aide through household work, and that connection made every pause inside the room feel heavier. She did not step forward to defend him immediately. She did not accuse him either. She watched as Charles questioned the situation, while Catherine watched her reaction. William noticed Catherine watching. The room had become a chain of silent observations, each person measuring the others while the original question remained unanswered. Charles ordered the Aide escorted outside. The man left the room, but the tension did not leave with him. The king turned back toward the table, and then his attention moved toward Camilla. It was only a look, but it changed the emotional temperature of the meeting. A simple access problem had begun to look like something connected to the boundaries between royal households. Catherine felt the pressure of the moment without celebrating it. she had not raised an accusation against Camilla. She had noticed a person who seemed out of place, yet the consequences were already spreading. William remained beside her, while Camilla faced the uncomfortable reality that an employee associated with her household had been found inside a restricted discussion without documented approval.
My life will of course change as I take up my new responsibilities. It will no longer be possible for me to give so much of my time and energies to the charities and issues for which I care so deeply.
The room was quiet again, but the quiet was no longer ordinary. Charles had stopped the briefing because he did not know who had opened the door. That was the real problem. The aide himself could be removed in seconds. The person who allowed him inside could not be removed so easily. Whoever had created the opening was already somewhere inside the system. Charles asked security to trace the authorization. The request sounded administrative, but the meaning was much sharper. Every restricted meeting depends on a simple principle. The people inside must be known, approved, and accountable. Once that chain breaks, nobody can be certain where the information goes or who decided that the rules no longer applied. Catherine remembered something then. The face at the back of the room was not entirely unfamiliar. She had seen the same man before, weeks earlier, during a quieter moment at Windsor. She had noticed him speaking with a senior member of Camilla's household. Nothing openly dramatic had happened. There had been no confrontation or obvious breach. But something about that conversation had stayed with her. William noticed the change in Catherine's expression. He asked what she had remembered. She told him the man had appeared before, and that she had heard him asking about whether he would be present when Balmoral responsibilities were discussed. William became more attentive. If that recollection was accurate, the man's presence at Balmoral had not begun that afternoon. The question suddenly became larger. How had an aide known enough about a restricted Balmoral discussion to ask about being inside it before the meeting had even taken place? Charles had not yet heard the full story, but the access review was already moving in that direction. The king wanted records checked, including who had approved entries and whether any previous request involving the aide had been rejected. That last possibility mattered, because a refusal would mean someone had already decided that the man should not have access. And then another detail began to emerge. The aide had apparently not received individual clearance. Instead, another authorization had been used to allow him through a staff route. That was the moment the incident stopped looking like a simple mistake. Someone had made a decision. Someone had taken a person who was not on the approved list and moved him closer to a confidential royal discussion. Charles understood what that meant. The issue was no longer merely that an unfamiliar aide had appeared in the wrong room. The issue was whether someone inside the royal system had deliberately treated permission as something flexible. Camilla now faced a difficult position. Her household was connected to the man, yet the account did not establish that she personally ordered him into the briefing. That distinction mattered. The investigation was beginning to separate personal responsibility from institutional responsibility. A staff member could make a decision without the royal at the center of that household giving the instruction. Catherine watched the questions unfold and felt the weight of her earlier instinct. William, who had initially urged caution, now understood why the memory mattered. Neither wanted the incident to become a personal battle between households, but neither could ignore what the access trail appeared to suggest. The briefing had stopped. The aide had been removed. The room had fallen silent. Yet Charles knew the hardest question had not been answered. Who opened the door? And more importantly, who believed they had the authority to do it? That question would pull the investigation away from the stranger at the back of the room and toward the people who already belonged inside Balmoral. The answer was buried in an earlier decision made before Catherine noticed. Charles ordered the relevant staff member to be identified and brought before him. Catherine remained nearby. William stayed with her. Camilla did not leave either. The man had been escorted out, but the crisis was still sitting at the table. And before the next briefing could begin, someone was going to have to explain why a rejected name had somehow become an accepted presence inside the king's most private room. If you think Catherine did the right thing by refusing to ignore what she saw, share this story with someone who would have spoken up too. Subscribe if you want to follow what happens when the access records are finally examined.
If you look at the coronation footage as the king and queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey on the coronation Saturday, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
The next answer makes it personal. The most troubling part of Catherine's discovery was not that the unfamiliar Aide had appeared inside Balmoral. It was that she had seen him before, long before Charles stopped the briefing. While the king's staff were still trying to establish how the man had entered the room, Catherine was already reaching back to a quieter moment at Windsor. A face she had almost dismissed as insignificant suddenly looked different. The question was no longer why he had appeared that afternoon. It was how he seemed to know he might be there. Weeks earlier, Catherine had been leaving a private family gathering at Windsor when she noticed the same man speaking with a senior member of Camilla's household. Windsor Castle is one of the monarchy's principal royal residences, used for official duties as well as private family occasions. The corridor had been quiet, and the conversation did not appear to attract attention. Yet Catherine slowed when she heard the aide ask whether he would be inside when the Balmoral responsibilities were discussed. The question stayed with her because the Balmoral discussion was not something staff could simply assume they would attend. Catherine did not confront the man or accuse the senior employee beside him. She remembered his face and continued walking. At the time, the exchange could have had an innocent explanation. There was no proof that the aide had been promised entry. William noticed that something had changed in her expression as they moved away. She told him what she had heard and explained why the question bothered her. The prince listened. His response was cautious. He reminded her that hearing one sentence in a corridor was not enough to establish what someone intended. The advice made sense, and Catherine accepted it, but the unease remained. That forgotten conversation became important the moment Catherine saw the aide inside Balmoral. Recognition came before certainty. She knew the face. She knew where she had seen it. And she remembered the strange question about being inside the future briefing. What had seemed insignificant at Windsor now appeared to sit directly beside the interruption Charles had just ordered. William understood the connection too. He had initially treated Catherine's concern as something that needed more information, not immediate suspicion. Now he realized the earlier warning had contained a detail neither of them could explain. The aide had apparently known that Balmoral responsibilities would be discussed, and he had asked whether he would be present. The question was simple. The timing was not. Catherine did not claim to know what the conversation meant. That restraint mattered. She was not presenting a conclusion. She was presenting a memory. But inside a royal household where access to confidential meetings depends on precise boundaries, memories become important when records begin pointing in the same direction. Charles was already waiting for those records. The king had ordered staff to examine the access trail, meaning the documented chain showing who was permitted to enter, when they entered, and whose authority allowed them through. The first review raised a more uncomfortable possibility. The aide's name had apparently been considered for Balmoral access before the briefing, yet the request had not been approved. That detail changed everything. A rejected request should have ended the matter. If someone was not approved, that person should not simply appear inside the meeting later. Yet the aide had been there. The distance between those two facts was where the real mystery lived. Security traced the entry backward. They checked the attendance list and authorization records. Each step narrowed the possibilities. The aide had not entered under his own clearance. Another staff authorization appeared to have been used. Charles was informed of the finding, and the king's reaction was clear. He did not treat the discrepancy as an ordinary administrative error. Someone had refused the aid, yet someone else had apparently found a way to let him through. Catherine heard the update and felt her earlier memory settle differently. The aide had asked whether he would be inside the Balmoral discussion. Weeks later, he was. Between those moments sat an authorization that should not have existed. William understood the danger. If the aide had gained access through another person's permission, the breach was not simply about one man crossing a doorway. It raised questions about who inside the household had authority to make that happen. Camilla now stood closer to the center of those questions because the aide was associated with her household. Yet association was not proof of instruction. Nothing established that she had personally ordered the man into Charles's briefing. The concern was whether someone working within her household had acted beyond the permission they actually possessed.
I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there. It must have been so difficult for her being a solitary woman. There weren't women prime ministers or women presidents. She was the only one, so I think she carved her own role.
The atmosphere around Balmoral tightened. The original briefing had been stopped, but the investigation was moving in a direction nobody could comfortably control. Charles wanted the name behind authorization. Catherine wanted to understand why the man had seemed certain about his place inside the meeting. William wanted to know whether his earlier caution had been misplaced. Camilla faced the possibility that a failure within her household could affect trust far beyond her office. Then another detail surfaced. Earlier that same day, someone had reportedly refused the aide access. That meant the man had not merely wandered into a controlled area because of confusion. Someone had encountered the question of his access and said no. Yet later, he was inside the room. The refusal became the key piece of the puzzle. If one employee had said no, who had authority to say yes? The answer would determine whether Charles faced a mistake, an unauthorized favor, or an attempt to place the aide close enough to hear information he had never been cleared to receive. And Catherine's memory made the timing harder to ignore. She had heard the aide ask about being inside the Balmoral discussion before the meeting happened. Now the access record suggested that his presence had required an intervention after an earlier refusal. Two separate pieces of information were beginning to touch. The palace could have treated the Windsor encounter as meaningless or the Balmoral breach as a paperwork error. Together, however, the two incidents created a pattern that demanded a closer look. Catherine did not need to accuse anyone. The records were beginning to ask the question for her. Who had told the aide that he would be where he needed to be? That phrase from the Windsor conversation suddenly carried a different weight. If the account was accurate, someone had spoken with confidence about his future presence before the relevant access had been approved. That did not prove wrongdoing. It did, however, make the timing difficult to dismiss. The investigation moved deeper into the household offices. Those offices manage schedules, correspondence, staffing, and access for individual royals. Their boundaries exist for a reason. When one office reaches into another office's confidential arrangements, routine coordination can become sensitive. Charles knew the distinction mattered. Coordination was normal. Unauthorized access was not. The king therefore asked staff to identify the person connected to the authorization that had allowed the aide through. The request was direct. There would be no guessing, no convenient assumption, and no attempt to close the matter simply because the briefing had already been interrupted. Catherine remained nearby. William stayed with her. Camilla remained engaged because the aide's connection to her household made the consequences impossible to separate from her office. Then the name appeared. It belonged to a senior member of the household staff. The same chain of inquiry that had begun with Catherine noticing a stranger was now pointing towards someone trusted enough to possess meaningful access. That was the moment the investigation changed character. The question was no longer whether the aide belonged in the room. He had not been on the approved list. The question was, who had decided that the rules could be bent? Charles ordered the senior staff member brought before him. Catherine had noticed the face. William had remembered the warning. Camilla now faced the implications for her household. The king was about to ask the question nobody inside Balmoral could avoid. Who authorized him? If you have followed this far, do not let the question disappear into another royal headline. Like this video if you believe private royal rules should mean something. Share it with someone who would demand the same accountability, and subscribe if you want to see where this trail leads. Because the next answer would not come from the aide who entered the room. It would come from someone who already had permission to be there. The senior staff member entered the room, knowing that Charles was waiting for an answer. The king did not greet him. The attendance record was already open on the table, and the missing name sat beside the authorization that had allowed the aide into Balmoral. Catherine remained nearby with William, while Camilla watched. The stranger was gone, but the person who opened the door stood before the king. Charles pointed to the record and asked one question. Who had told the aide that he could enter? The staff member hesitated before explaining that there had been confusion over access. Charles listened without interrupting. The explanation might have sounded harmless elsewhere, but this was not ordinary. A restricted briefing is a meeting limited to approved people because sensitive information may be discussed inside it. Confusion over one name could become a serious failure of control. Catherine watched the exchange carefully. She had already seen the aide's face before Balmoral, and now she understood why the memory would not leave her alone. William stayed beside her, listening as the explanation began to unravel. Camilla remained composed, but the pressure had shifted toward her household. The staff member was connected to an office associated with the Queen Consort, and Charles wanted to know exactly where that connection ended and personal responsibility began. The staff member repeated that the aide had been expected to assist with future coordination. Charles asked why that required the man to sit inside a confidential briefing. No immediate answer came. The silence mattered. If the aide only needed information about future responsibilities, there were ordinary channels for passing that information later. He did not need to hear a private discussion before receiving permission to do so. Catherine finally spoke about the earlier Windsor encounter. She explained how she had seen the same aide speaking with a senior member of Camilla's household, and how she had heard him ask whether he would be inside when the Balmoral responsibilities were discussed. She did not claim to know what the conversation meant. She remembered the words and the face. William understood why that memory had become important. The prince had urged caution when Catherine first mentioned the encounter. Now he could see that the aide's question had been unusually specific. He looked toward the staff member and waited for an explanation. The room became quieter because the Windsor conversation had connected the earlier moment to the access problem now sitting in front of Charles. Charles asked whether the aide had been formally cleared for the Balmoral briefing. The answer was no. The king then asked whether the original request for access had been approved. Again, the answer was no. The staff member acknowledged the aide had not received individual clearance. Yet he had still been allowed into the room. That was the break in the story. Someone had known the rules. Someone had seen the refusal. Someone had decided the refusal would not be the final answer. Charles leaned back and studied the record. He did not need to raise his voice. The facts were becoming sharper with every question. A rejected request, followed by an unauthorized entry, was not simply a misplaced invitation. It was a decision made somewhere inside the chain of authority. Camilla intervened through a measured response, making clear that she had not personally instructed the aide to enter the briefing. Her position was important because the man's connection to her household could easily turn suspicion toward her. She could accept that a failure had occurred within her office without accepting responsibility for an order she said she had never given. Charles listened. The king then asked the staff member whether Camilla had told him to bring the aide into the meeting. The staff member said no. The answer settled one question, but opened another. If Camilla had not given the instruction, who had? The staff member finally admitted that he had allowed the aide inside so the man could observe the discussion and prepare for future coordination involving Camilla's office. The admission changed everything. The aide had not simply been confused about where he belonged. He had apparently been brought into the meeting for a reason. Charles asked why the aide had been permitted to observe a discussion for which he had not been approved. The staff member explained that he believed the presence would make later coordination easier. That answer revealed the problem clearly. Convenience had been placed ahead of permission. Catherine felt the weight of that admission. She had not wanted the matter to become a personal confrontation between households. She had noticed something that felt wrong, and spoken before the discussion continued. Now the reason for her concern was beginning to emerge. William also understood the cost of his earlier caution. He had not done anything wrong by asking for more information, but the prince could now see why Catherine had remembered the Windsor encounter. The warning had been there before anyone knew it mattered. Charles asked the final question that had been waiting since the briefing stopped. Had the aide been told that his presence was approved by the king? The staff member answered no. The king asked whether the man had been told another senior authority approved him. The staff member admitted that the aide had been told the Queen's office had handled the matter. Camilla reacted immediately. She denied giving that instruction. Her response was not presented as proof that every detail had been resolved. Instead, it created a sharper conflict between what the aide believed and what the Queen Consort said she had authorized. Charles now faced a more difficult problem. The breach had not come from outside the palace. It had come through people already trusted with access. That distinction mattered more than the identity of the aide. That realization made the silence around the table harder now. A stranger could be removed. A weakness inside the system could return, unless someone understood how it had been created.
The king ordered the access trail reviewed again.
Staff were told to trace every authorization connected to the aide, including the earlier refusal and the later approval. He wanted the exact point where one decision changed into another. The review was about finding who moved that name closer to the briefing. Catherine remained silent while the staff began checking the records. She had triggered the interruption, but she did not want credit for it. Her concern was simpler. If she had ignored the man, Charles might have continued speaking while an unauthorized person listened. Whatever information was discussed could have traveled beyond the room without anyone knowing. William understood that too. The prince recognized that her instinct had protected the meeting before anyone confirmed the danger. He did not tell her she had been right in triumph. He simply understood that the decision to speak had mattered. Camilla faced a different kind of pressure. Her household had become part of an investigation that could easily be interpreted as a contest for influence. She knew that defending every action simply because it came from her staff would not restore trust. Yet allowing one employee's decision to become a judgment against her entire household would be equally unfair. Charles saw the tension building and made one point clear. The review would concern actions, records, and authorization. It would not become a personal contest between Catherine and Camilla. The king needed facts alone. That decision temporarily steadied the room. Then the security team returned with another detail. The aide had reportedly been refused access earlier that same day. Catherine heard the update and immediately understood its significance. The refusal meant someone had already recognized that the man was not cleared. Yet later, he appeared inside the briefing. William realized the same thing. Charles asked who had overruled the refusal. Nobody answered immediately. The silence was longer this time. The king looked toward the senior staff member. The staff member lowered his eyes, and the atmosphere changed again. The person who brought the aide into the room was no longer an abstract possibility. There was now a direct path leading towards someone with enough authority to bypass an earlier decision. Charles ordered that person's role in the access decision be documented before the review continued. The king would not accept another explanation. Every step had to be accounted for. Catherine understood that the mystery had moved beyond the aide. William understood that. Camilla knew the next answer could affect her household for much longer than one interrupted briefing. The room had started with a stranger. Now it contained a question nobody wanted to answer. Who had decided that the king's refusal did not matter? And as the records were placed in front of Charles, the answer was finally close enough to expose the person who had made that decision. If this story makes you question what really happens when trusted people start treating rules as suggestions, do not scroll away and let the moment disappear. Like this video if you believe accountability should apply even inside the most powerful households, share it with someone who would want the truth examined, and subscribe, because the next revelation takes this from a security problem to a direct challenge inside Charles's own household. Charles did not need another warning. The answer was already sitting inside the records, and the longer the senior staff member remained silent, the harder it became to describe the breach as an innocent mistake. Catherine watched from across the room, while William stayed close beside her. Camilla remained composed, but the pressure around her household had become impossible to ignore. The aide had been removed. The briefing had been stopped. Now Charles wanted the person who had made that possible. The king pushed the access record forward and asked the staff member to explain the rejected request. The employee described it as an attempt to prepare for future coordination involving Camilla's office. Coordination meant different royal teams sharing information about schedules, responsibilities, and arrangements so their work could fit together. But Charles was not asking whether the aide might eventually need information. He was asking why the man had been placed inside a confidential meeting before that need had become authorized. The staff member shifted his explanation again. He said the aide had been allowed to observe because his future duties could overlap with the responsibilities being discussed. Charles listened without interrupting. That restraint made the room feel colder. The king was giving the explanation every opportunity to stand on its own, and it was failing. Catherine remembered the Windsor conversation with greater clarity. She had heard the aide ask whether he would be inside when Balmoral responsibilities were discussed. At the time, the question had seemed strange but inconclusive. Now it sounded like a preview of what would happen weeks later. She explained that memory again, carefully separating what she had actually heard from what she could only suspect. William understood the difference. The prince did not turn Catherine's recollection into an accusation. He recognized that the timing was the important part. The aide had apparently known enough to ask about a private discussion before his access had been approved. That did not prove why he knew. It did prove that someone had to explain the connection. Camilla finally spoke. She said, through the account of the questioning, that she had never instructed the aide to enter Charles's restricted briefing. Her household may have been involved in future coordination, but that did not give an employee permission to bypass the king's access procedures. The distinction mattered because the investigation could easily have become a story about Catherine confronting Camilla. It was becoming something more complicated. Charles turned back to the staff member. If Camilla had not authorized the entry, who had? The employee admitted that he had made the decision himself after believing the aide needed to understand the discussion before future responsibilities were assigned. The admission landed heavily because it answered the central question while creating an even larger one. Why had a trusted employee believed he could make that decision? The king asked whether the employee understood that the aide had already been refused access. The answer was yes. Charles paused. That single admission destroyed the idea that the entry had resulted from simple confusion. The refusal was known. The restriction was understood. Yet the boundary had still been crossed. Catherine felt the tension sharpen. William looked toward the king. Camilla remained still. Charles now had something more concrete than suspicion. He had an internal decision that appeared to have overridden an earlier refusal. The monarch ordered the complete access trail brought into the room. The review of that trail meant checking each recorded authorization connected to the aide, from the original request to the moment he entered Balmoral. Staff began matching names, times, and permissions. Every detail mattered because the king wanted to know whether the staff member had acted alone or whether someone else had encouraged the decision. The records showed that the aide's original request had not received individual clearance. Another authorization had later been used to permit his movement through a staff route. Charles asked who controlled that authorization. The answer pointed back toward the household staff already connected to Camilla's office. Camilla reacted with visible frustration. She understood why suspicion was moving toward her household, but she also understood that responsibility could not be assigned simply because an employee worked for her. She insisted that no instruction from her had told the aide to enter the briefing. Her position remained consistent. She could acknowledge a failure inside her household without accepting an order she said she never made. Charles accepted the distinction, but did not soften the consequences. A household office could not use its own internal judgment to replace the king's permission for a confidential meeting. That boundary existed precisely because royal households operated alongside one another while handling different responsibilities. William recognized what his father was protecting. The future king had spent the afternoon watching a small access problem become a question about institutional trust. If employees could make exceptions whenever they believed those exceptions were useful, then the rules around private meetings meant very little. Catherine looked toward Camilla. Neither woman spoke. The tension between them was no longer about whether one had noticed the aide. It was about what the incident might do to relationships inside the family. Catherine had spoken because she felt something was wrong. Camilla now faced the consequences of a failure connected to her office. Neither woman had created the entire situation. Then the staff member revealed another detail. He had not acted because the aide demanded entry. He had allowed the man inside because he believed observing the discussion would help with future coordination. That explanation sounded practical, even reasonable, until Charles asked the question that exposed its weakness. Who gave him permission to decide that? The staff member had no answer. Charles closed the folder for a moment. The king had heard enough to understand the basic failure. A person without individual clearance had entered a restricted briefing because an employee believed the information would be useful to him later. The intention might have been presented as administrative convenience. The result was still an unauthorized presence inside a sensitive discussion. The king then made a temporary decision. The senior staff member would be removed from confidential briefing responsibilities while the review continued. That did not yet settle every question, but it sent a clear message. Access to Charles's private discussions was not something employees could adjust according to convenience. Camilla took the decision personally, even though the account did not establish that she had ordered the breach. Her concern was that one employee's decision could make her entire household appear untrustworthy. Charles understood that concern, but he also understood the opposite danger. Protecting appearances could never come before protecting the meeting. The king still wanted one final answer. The king asked one final question about the aide's purpose. If the man had been brought inside to prepare for future coordination, who had told him that he would be there? The staff member answered that the aide had been led to believe the Queen's office had handled the matter. Camilla immediately rejected that claim. She had not personally authorized the entry. The statement created a dangerous gap between what the aide believed and what the Queen Consort said she had approved. Charles now had to determine whether someone had spoken in Camilla's name without authority, or whether an assumption inside the household had been allowed to grow into an instruction. The answer mattered now. Catherine remained quiet, but her earlier memory had become central to the investigation. William could see that the story had moved far beyond the stranger they first noticed. Camilla could see that her household now had to answer for a decision she said she never ordered. Charles could see the deeper weakness. Trust had been treated as permission, and that was more dangerous than one unauthorized name on an attendance list. By evening, Charles ordered a broader review of sensitive access procedures around Balmoral. Every restricted briefing would be examined for the same weakness. The king wanted to know whether this had been one employee's isolated decision or evidence of a wider habit of informal permissions. That review created the next problem. If one refusal had already been overturned, there could be another person behind the decision. Charles knew the answer could not remain buried inside the staff records. He needed the people involved to explain themselves directly. Catherine had identified the face. William had recognized the warning. Camilla now faced questions about the boundaries of her household, and Charles was preparing to draw a line that would affect all of them. The crisis had begun with a man standing silently at the back of a room. It was now threatening the trust between the people who controlled access to that room. If you believe Charles was right to stop everything, rather than pretend the breach did not matter, make your position known. Like this video, share it with someone who would refuse to look away, and subscribe, because the next decision will determine whether this ends as one employee's mistake or becomes a lasting change inside the royal household. Charles looked once more at the access record. The name that had caused the briefing to stop was no longer the most important name on the page. The person who had opened the door was. Charles had stopped the briefing, removed the uninvited aide, and ordered the access trail examined. But the most difficult decision was still waiting. The king now had to decide whether Balmoral had suffered a simple lapse, or whether trusted people had allowed convenience to replace authority. Catherine had seen the warning. William had understood it too late. Camilla's household was under pressure. And Charles knew the next conversation could determine whether the incident ended quietly or changed the rules around the royal family. The review continued into the evening. Staff compared the rejected request with the later authorization and examined the internal communications surrounding the aide's arrival. The purpose was straightforward: establish who knew he had been refused, who later allowed him through, and whether anyone had represented that permission as coming from a senior royal. An internal review, meaning a private examination of records and staff decisions, was designed to separate assumptions from responsibility. Catherine remained troubled by what the records appeared to confirm. She had not wanted to become the person who stopped a royal briefing. She had simply noticed something that did not belong and refused to ignore it. William understood that now. His earlier instinct had been to wait for more information, but the prince could see why Catherine's memory had mattered. The same aide she had noticed at Windsor had appeared inside the Balmoral meeting after apparently being denied individual clearance. Camilla faced the hardest personal consequence. The aide was linked to her household, yet the account did not establish that she had ordered him into the room. That distinction remained important. She could acknowledge that someone within her office had made a serious mistake without accepting responsibility for an instruction she said she never gave. Still, the Queen Consort knew that trust does not remain untouched simply because the person at the top did not personally give the order. Charles understood that better than anyone around the table. The monarchy depended on layers of staff, advisors, security officers, and household offices. But those layers only worked when everyone understood the boundaries of authority. A private royal briefing could not become open to whoever an employee believed might find the information useful. If that happened once, the danger was not only what had already been heard. The danger was what others might assume they could do next. The king therefore made his first major decision. The senior employee, who had overridden the earlier refusal, would be removed from confidential briefing responsibilities while the review was completed. The decision was not presented as revenge. It was a direct response to the breach. Someone had exercised authority they did not possess, and Charles was no longer willing to leave that boundary unclear. Camilla was angry. She believed years of loyal service within her household should not disappear because of one employee's judgment. Yet she also understood why Charles could not simply overlook the matter. Her frustration was not proof of guilt. It was the reaction of someone watching a mistake connected to her office damage confidence around her. She wanted the failure examined without allowing suspicion to spread beyond the evidence. Catherine understood that feeling. She had no desire to see Camilla humiliated. Her concern had always been the integrity of the meeting. When she and the Queen Consort finally spoke privately, There were no staff members between them and no audience waiting for a dramatic confrontation. Catherine explained that she had spoken because the aide's presence felt wrong. She had not intended to turn a security concern into a personal accusation. Camilla listened. The Queen Consort acknowledged that something inside her household had gone badly wrong, but she also maintained that she had never instructed the aide to enter Charles's briefing. The two positions could exist at the same time. A household could fail without its senior member personally ordering every action. That understanding prevented the incident from becoming a simple battle between two women. William watched the consequences unfold and recognized a lesson that reached beyond the afternoon itself. The future king had seen how quickly a small exception could become a threat to confidence. He had also seen how Charles handled the pressure. The monarch did not protect appearances by pretending nothing had happened. He stopped the meeting, demanded the records, listened to competing explanations, and then changed the rules. That response mattered. The most important consequence was not the aide losing access. It was the recognition that permission could never be replaced by assumption. Charles wanted every person entering a restricted royal briefing to have individual authorization. In simple terms, each attendee would need to be approved by name. One household could no longer rely on its own general authority to place someone inside another household's confidential meeting. The rule was deliberately narrow because the problem had been narrow. Charles was not declaring war on Camilla's household. He was not accusing Catherine of overstepping. He was not turning one employee's mistake into a permanent division within the family. He was closing the gap that had allowed the mistake to happen. The uninvited aide would not receive future access to restricted meetings unless separately cleared. The senior staff member who had overridden the refusal would remain removed from confidential briefing responsibilities. The internal review would close after the relevant records and decisions had been examined. No evidence in the supplied account established that Camilla personally ordered the intrusion, and Charles did not treat the connection to her household as proof that she had done so. For Catherine, the ending brought relief rather than victory. She had been uncomfortable from the moment she noticed the man at the back of the room. Speaking up had created tension, and she knew that some people could have interpreted her action as interference. Charles eventually made clear that he saw it differently. Her interruption had been uncomfortable, but it had protected the meeting. That acknowledgement mattered to her because she had never wanted applause. She wanted the concern taken seriously. Camilla also accepted something difficult. Responsibility inside a household cannot stop at personal intention. Even when a senior royal has not given an instruction, decisions made by trusted employees can still affect the confidence others place in that office. The Queen Consort could reject an order she never gave while accepting that the system around her had failed. William carried away perhaps the most lasting lesson. He had seen Catherine notice the warning before he understood its significance. He had seen Charles refuse to let uncertainty continue simply because confronting it was uncomfortable. For the future king, that was the real inheritance of the crisis. Authority was not only about making decisions, it was about knowing when to stop everything until the right decision could be made. By the time the matter was formally closed, Balmoral had become more than the location of an interrupted meeting. It had become a test of trust. The room had exposed a weakness that could have remained invisible if Catherine had looked away. The aide might have listened. The briefing might have continued. Nobody might have realized that the person sitting inside had never received individual approval. That possibility stayed with Charles. The king eventually returned to the same briefing room. The atmosphere was different. The people entering had been checked individually. The rules were clearer. The uncertainty that had stopped the earlier meeting had been removed. Catherine was present. William was present. Camilla was present. The door was closed only after the authorized names had been confirmed. Charles waited. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the monarch calmly began the discussion. Now they could begin. The significance of that moment was not that Charles had defeated another household, it was that he had refused to allow appearances to become more important than trust. Catherine had noticed the weakness. Camilla had confronted the consequences within her office. William had learned what an early warning can mean when it is taken seriously. Charles had responded by making the boundary stronger than it had been before. And that was why the Balmoral interruption mattered. The first briefing ended because one person did not belong in the room. The next began because everyone who remained understood exactly why they did. If this story made you question whether trusted people should ever be allowed to bend rules simply because they believe they are helping, then make your position clear. Like this video if you believe Charles was right to stop the briefing instead of protecting appearances. Share it with someone who would have spoken up in Catherine's position. And subscribe if you believe accountability should not disappear simply because the people involved belong to the royal household. The controversy may fade from the headlines, but the lesson inside it is harder to dismiss. A closed door only protects a private conversation when everyone inside understands who has the authority to open it. At Balmoral, one unexpected presence exposed that weakness. Charles answered it with a boundary, and this time, the boundary was unmistakable. Because once trust is weakened inside a private room, restoring it requires more than removing one person. It requires everyone to understand the rule again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.